right over the water fountain that says, it's entitled, "Have You Been Reading the Apostles' Mail?" And I think it's a very clever title because we don't often think of reading, especially the later books in the New Testament, as someone else's mail, as letters, and that's essentially what they are. I think it's hard for us to see that because in our day and age, reading someone else's mail is a federal offense that can earn you up to 5 years in prison. I would really hate to be that guy that read someone else's mail and I got stuck in a cell with a murderer and a drug dealer and they asked me, what are you in here for? And then I had to tell them I'm here for reading someone else's mail. I don't feel like I would look as intimidating as I needed to be to survive that kind of environment, but nonetheless, it is what it is. And when we do read these letters, most notably like 2 Corinthians, which we're going to be looking at today, it is someone else's mail. It is a letter. And there are some obstacles that we run into when we study passages like this, because it's not a series of letters written back and forth, because if it was, there would at least be a context. Someone said this and someone responded to that. Paul in this letter is referencing things that are happening at that church and even things that he personally did that we don't really have a context for anywhere else. And so it's a little bit difficult for us to do some of the research and to figure out what Paul is doing, but it can be done. If we look at this letter or any other letter in the New Testament as half of a conversation, and we ask ourselves, well, why did they choose to talk about this? Or why is Paul writing about this? Why is he handling this subject in this way? We're able to reconstruct some of the ideas that prompted Paul to write this letter. And there's a certain passage I want to look at. I want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 10. But before we do, let's talk about the context and what prompted Paul to deal with some of these issues the way he did. Now, I think it's fair to say we have no other record of any other church having this many issues in the first century than we do have with the church at Corinth. On one hand, it's kind of sad because we expect Christians to live spiritual and mature lives, and this is something that the Corinthians struggled to do. On the other hand, it's kind of good for us because, unfortunately, from time to time, we run into some difficult issues. And it's nice to know how Paul, an apostle, handled all of these issues, and it kind of gives us a little bit of guidance. But one of the main issues at the church at Corinth that we find in most notably 1 Corinthians chapter 5 was the incestuous adulterer. There appears to have been a man who was having an affair with, of all things, his stepmother. This upsetted Paul quite a bit because not even the pagans practice such a thing. And there is evidence from the letter of 2 Corinthians that when Paul initially sent out that letter, they did not initially do what was required. They did not initially discipline him, withdraw their fellowship from him. You can see in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, that when Paul visited the church at Corinth, there was a lot of drama. There was a lot of pain. There was a lot of sorrow. And if you look at verses 5 and 7, he seems to attribute this pain to this particular offender. Now, one might ask, well, why was there so much pain in this last visit if the Corinthians had already dealt with this issue? Well, some, use this passage to indicate that they hadn't. That when Paul came to the church at Corinth, when he visited them another time in between the letters of 1 and 2 Corinthians, that he had to deal with this issue. And it caused them a lot of pain. And you can see when you read this letter, Paul is in pain writing this letter because he knows there has been a wedge that has been created between him and his brethren at the church at Corinth. Now, he also deals within this letter a faction that is associated with the church at Corinth, or within the church at Corinth itself, that is trying to discredit Paul. And some commentators have suggested that this faction was spawned by this particular event. It was so painful, it was so difficult, that they began to doubt Paul and his apostleship. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13, he calls these men false apostles. It also seems from 2 Corinthians 11:5 that he sarcastically calls them the eminent apostles or the super apostles, that these men are far more better and far more well put together than Paul is. He says that sarcastically speaking. And we have record within this letter that these individuals were not saying nice things about Paul. We see in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, they were criticizing his public speaking ability. Do you ever want a preacher to feel really bad about himself? Tell him what a terrible preacher he is. And that's exactly what they were telling him. Notice what, in 2 Corinthians 10:10, notice what they said about him. His letters are weighty and strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive, and his speech is contemptible. Imagine any of you men who gave a devotional on a Wednesday night or just decided to preach on a Sunday morning or Sunday night, and someone at the back said, "You don't really have any presence and your speech is contemptible. You probably never want to speak again." I know I certainly would never want to preach again, but that's what they were saying about Paul. They were basically saying he's all big and bad in his letters, but when he comes to us, he's unimpressive. They also criticized his finances. You can see that in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 7 through 11. You see, one of the things that Paul did is that when he visited the church at Corinth, he didn't take any financial support from them. He got financial support from other places. From his perspective, what he was trying to do was not to be a financial burden to them. He didn't want to make things difficult from them. Well, apparently they took it the wrong way. And it seems that perhaps they had the idea that if someone's a professional, will you pay them? Well, we're not paying Paul. Is he really that special? We also see in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, that they were criticizing his credibility. You see, when Paul, he came to the church at Corinth, he thought he had proved himself as an apostle. But they were pretty much asking for letters of recommendation, practically our idea of a resume. Have you really proved to yourselves that you are an apostle? And all these things that Paul did, he tried to do out of humility, but they were not appreciating it. And they were not thinking of him as the way they should have. And as we're about to see, it also seems, as you read through the letter of 2 Corinthians, they take a great deal of pleasure in personal revelations. As we see in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, it was not uncommon for a Christian to receive a special revelation, a special vision from God. It appears that this particular faction took a lot of pride in this, and we know from 1 Corinthians, the church liked their miracles. They liked being able to perform them, but unfortunately they were using them the wrong way. But as we'll see in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and if you will turn with me there, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, Paul is going to indulge in their foolishness. He's going to show them that they're placing their emphasis and their ideas of what greatness is in the wrong things. And he's going to go on to show them how they should focus more on their weaknesses and on their difficulties than on the things in which they are blessed with. So let's read 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. "Boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. But I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise, and heard inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. On behalf of such a man I will boast. On behalf of such a man I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in regard to my weaknesses. For I do wish to boast, I will not be foolish. For I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from this, so that no one will credit me with more than what he sees or hears from me." Now we see he opens up in verse 1, and he's going to indulge in some of their ideas of what they think makes a great Christian or an apostle, revelations from God. In verse 1, he says, boasting is necessary, though it is not profitable. I like the way the ESV translates verse 1. Paul says, "I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it." Paul's basically saying, I'm going to indulge in this boasting, this bragging that you want, but I'm going to show you how pointless it is. And he begins to talk about a vision, something they apparently appreciated. But he does it in a very unusual way. He talks in third person. Has anyone ever seen or talked to anyone who talked in third person? Or at least seen it on TV? It's kind of weird. It's kind of awkward. But that's what Paul is doing, and it appears he has a reason for it. As we see in verse 5 and as we see in verse 7, it seems clear that he is talking about himself. But he's doing it in third person to distance himself as much as possible from this boasting. He's going to boast, to indulge in their foolishness for a moment, But he still wants them to, instead of focusing on this vision, he wants them to focus on something else, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, in this vision, which he said happened 14 years ago, it was a very unique experience because he didn't know if it was in the body or out of the body. He didn't know if he was in the spirit or in his mind, or if he was bodily transported to another place. But he did know where he was. He was caught up to the third heaven, the paradise of God. The word there for caught up is the Greek word harpazo, and it's the same word used in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17 to describe how Christians will meet Christ on the last day. They will be caught up, they will be snatched, they will be grabbed quickly to be with Christ. Now, in Jewish literature, there were several ideas about the heavens. Some Jews thought there were 7 heavens, some thought there were 3. Some have suggested that what Paul is talking about is the first heaven, the 3 heavens, the sky, the space, and then the place where God dwells. Paul just as easily could just be exaggerating, saying the highest point, wherever that place is, that's where God is, and that's where I was. Paul calls this the paradise of God. Now, typically, I think when we think of a paradise, we think of maybe a nice white sandy beach with a hammock caught in between 2 palm trees, maybe drinking a fruity drink out of a coconut. Maybe that's what we think of when we think of a paradise. Well, this wasn't the ancient idea of what a paradise was. Most literally, what this word means is an enclosed garden or a enclosed orchard. Probably doesn't sound too luxurious for us, but in the ancient times, this was the idea of luxury. And so they thought that, wherever God is going to be, it's going to be a luxurious place. Now, of course, we can imagine how beautiful and how splendid this realm would be. But that's not what Paul chose to focus on. As we see in verse 4, he says that while he was there, he heard inexpressible words that he was not permitted to speak. Maybe this was a special message that only he was to receive, and he could not tell anyone. But as we see in verses 5 through 6, he chose not to take pride in this. Now, wouldn't it be cool if you went to heaven? I'm pretty sure that if you went to heaven, you'd feel very special. You would think that God had given you a gift that he doesn't often give many people. You might even try to do what most people do. You might try to write a book or make a movie. But I think it's odd that we know that Paul experienced this, and he does the opposite of what most people do. So it kind of makes me wonder about the people who claim that they went to heaven or that they saw heaven, because they do the exact opposite of what Paul did. Paul, he gives no such details, and he doesn't really want to brag about this at all. Paul says in verse 6 that he wants to be judged based off what other people can see and experience through him. And as we see in verse 5, he chooses rather to boast and to take pride in his weaknesses than this glory that was given to him. Which leads us to our next point. If you'll read with me verses 7 through 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power, or my power, is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distress, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, we know that Paul was a highly blessed individual, and he had plenty to brag about. And often in his letters, he would indulge in a little bragging just to prove the point that what he was bragging about didn't really matter, or it wasn't really something to focus on. And God had blessed him in so many ways. Remember when he was on his way to Damascus, while he was still persecuting the church, he saw the risen Lord. And we know that apparently at one time he saw heaven itself. But one of the greatest temptations to people who are given prestige or honor or a special position, even the position of an apostle, is to fall into pride. Now, pride is something that is condemned constantly all throughout Scripture. Nebuchadnezzar was condemned because of his pride. The king of Tyre was condemned because of his pride. Even Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, that pride is the condemnation of the devil, perhaps the very sin that brought his downfall. And if one is not careful, anyone can be destroyed. Even an apostle can be spiritually destroyed because of pride. But God gave Paul a little help. Apparently, Satan brought something into his life that was very difficult to deal with. Paul calls it a thorn. And there's so much debate on what that thorn is. It isn't even funny. There have been debates about what that thorn is since the 2nd century. If you look at all of history from the 2nd century till today, there are so many different ideas as to what this thorn is. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but we do know that whatever it is or whatever it was, it caused Paul a lot of pain. It was very difficult. It was so difficult that it was very hard for him to take pride in anything. And he prayed 3 times for its removal. But God said no. So let's talk about some of the implications of this passage and what we can learn from it. What do we take pride in? I think that's a very important question that we should often ask ourselves. What are we taking pride in our lives? Because often what we take pride in gives us a certain amount of value and confidence. Paul did not want to take pride in things that were out of his control. For example, have you ever seen someone win the lottery, maybe in person or on TV? Have you ever thought to yourself when you see someone win the lottery how special and how unique that person must be because they won the lottery? That's not typically what you think, is it? You think they were lucky. Now, being lucky, there's nothing wrong with being lucky. I like a little luck. I'm sure you like a little luck. But when something is just randomly handed to you, it doesn't necessarily mean you're special or unique. Now, I'm not equating this to God's blessings. What I'm saying is that when good things happen to us, it doesn't necessarily mean we're special or we're better than other people. It just could mean that we're lucky or that God has blessed us in some way. And so Paul doesn't want to take pride in these blessings from God because at the end of the day, he knows he doesn't deserve them. He knew he was a persecutor of the church. He knew he gave his consent to the murder of Christians. And he was on his way to persecute other Christians did he finally change his mind. So he knew that these things he received from God were not because he was special or because he was better than other people, because God had blessed him. That's why in his letters he chooses to focus more on the grace of God than how great he is. And I think we should have the same attitude. Just because God gives us something special in our lives, we should be grateful, and we should, never forget what God has done. But it doesn't mean we should think of ourselves as higher than other people. And that's one of the points that Paul is trying to make here. Secondly, we should also consider what Paul's weakness or his thorn or his trial, whatever it is, what that means for us. Now, on one hand, I'm glad that we don't know what this thorn is because I think it helps us identify with Paul. Because we all have thorns, we all have difficulties. And because we don't know his difficulty, it's a little easy for us, just for our own reflection, to think about what Paul could be struggling with and how similar that could be to our situation as well. There's something we should observe and, might be a little bothered by, but also take comfort in. This thorn is from Satan. And as we talked about sometime last week, Satan can interfere with our lives. He can bring difficult things into our lives to affect our lives as Christians or to affect the way we live our lives, to get us to turn against God. We saw that he tried to distort creation, the world, Israel, and even the church till this day. Satan is always trying to distort what God has made or what God gives. But there's something comforting here, because even though we see that Satan is always trying to distort God's plans, God can still distort his plans as well. This is from Satan to destroy or to hinder Paul. And yet God is finding a use for this thorn. Even though it was meant to hinder Paul's work, God was using it to help Paul learn and grow, and to teach him to be the kind of person that God needed him to be. Which brings us to our next point. God's strength, or the strength that he supplies, is made perfect in weakness. God can do more with us in times of weakness than sometimes he can in times of our strength. And this is true of many people throughout the Bible. Perhaps Jesus is one of the greatest examples of that. Consider what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. The Hebrew writer says that Jesus was perfected through suffering. Now, we don't often like to use that word with Jesus, to say that Jesus was perfected, because when we think of the word perfected or perfect, we think of something without flaw. And by that definition, Jesus was perfect all the time. But he was not perfected, at least in the New Testament sense. The idea of perfect or perfection carries with it the idea of being everything a particular thing or person needs to be before God. And we can see based off what we read, or we could say based off what we read in the New Testament, that Jesus was not all that we needed him to be. He was not all that God needed him to be until he experienced the full suffering of the cross. And through that, he was able to be all that God needed him to be. Let me read you what the Hebrew writer says. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through suffering. If Jesus became all that God needed him to be through suffering, can't that be true of us today? This is also true of Paul. Paul admitted that he was a better servant, learning more from his weaknesses and being more because of his weaknesses than he was before. And so if Satan or even God himself brings something difficult into our lives, maybe it's important that we embrace it for what it is, and we allow that to make us the kind of people God needs us to be. Now, another thing we need to consider from this passage is that sometimes God tells us no. God often answers our prayers with what we have in mind. I've personally experienced this. I'm sure you have as well. And we see countless examples in the Old Testament and in the New Testament of God answering people's prayers with exactly with what they want. Sometimes it's even more. Sometimes God answers people's prayers with the not now. Say, I'm going to give this to you, but I'm not going to give it to you now. But we also see examples such as this where God says no. Notice what he tells Paul. My grace is sufficient for you, for power, my power, is perfected in weakness. Now, what is grace? Well, grace is divine favor, help, gracious care, or goodwill. And notice how how God responds to Paul. He was already supplying him with the grace that he needed even before he asked. He just wasn't going to remove the thorn. What should we take from this? Well, God had a use for the thorn to teach Paul about weakness and strength. And perhaps God was allowing this thorn to remain because he knew that there was more to be gained by it remaining than it to be taken away. And so God did not want to do a disservice to Paul. And maybe if we have a thorn that God will not remove, maybe it is for our benefit. Maybe this is something we need for at least a time, maybe even for a long time, to grow and to be what God needs us to be. So as we conclude, let's consider a few things. We all have thorns to varying degrees. We might have a thorn, we might have multiple thorns. Your thorn might come in the form as a person you just can't get rid of. That sounds a little mean. Let's say a person in your life that's just going to be there for a while. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it is someone at your work that you're just going to be stuck with for a while. And maybe they bring a lot of difficulty in your life. And maybe for right now, there's no getting away from them. Maybe the difficulty that comes from that, God can use to make you be the kind of patient and wise person you need to be. Maybe it's a financial hurdle. Maybe you have a lot of debt you have to deal with. Maybe you have a job where for right now you have to live paycheck to paycheck and there's no end in sight. And maybe that is going to be your thorn for a while. Well, maybe God can use that to teach you contentment and happiness. Maybe it's a health issue. Maybe physically speaking, genetically speaking, you were given the short straw. And that for the rest of your life, you will have more health issues than other people. And maybe that's a sad fact of life that you're simply stuck with that. Well, maybe God can use that to teach you to trust in him and rely on him for the things that are completely out of your control. Maybe it's a mental health issue. Maybe it's something like bipolar disorder. I've known many people to struggle with that, and it's a very difficult disorder. Maybe it's obsessive compulsive disorder. That one's mine. And as you can tell from looking at my office, it's not the neat and the orderly kind. But that's something I'm stuck with. There's no cure for that. And that's something I will have the rest of my life. And maybe there's some things that God can teach me from that. But we have to remember that if people like Jesus, people like Paul, were perfected, they became all that God needed them to be through their thorns and their trials, that shouldn't be any less true for us. And maybe we should take that to remember that when we go through our trials or we experience thorns, we should treat those as things to embrace and to learn from and to grow. And that's why Paul was writing this, to point out that even though God had given him many great things, including great visions, that he grew and he learned and he was more for God based off the difficulties in his life instead of these miraculous things. Although they were important, still Paul could learn and be more for God, focusing on the weaknesses and the difficulties than on these good things. And that it was foolish for the Corinthians to focus on these things that they thought were glorious and important, when they could have been focusing on other things that would have helped them be what God needed them to be. And that is true for us today. And if you're here today and there's some thorns or there's some difficulties in your life that you would like prayers about, we'd be glad to pray for you. And God will certainly help you. We see all throughout the Bible that God helps those who follow him. And God is willing to help, and he is willing to answer our prayers. And if there's anything we can pray about, we'd be glad to pray for you right now. And if there's anyone here who is not yet a Christian, and you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that he died for your sins, and you're willing to repent of those sins and put him on in baptism, we'd love to help you with that right now. If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.